Hello and welcome to the MovieKing Podcast. My name is David Jurmann and I'll be your host. On today's episode, I'll be reviewing the film Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning, and in the second half, I'll be reviewing the movie Lilo and Stitch. So starting off with Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning, who wasn't excited for this movie? I'm a very big fan of the Mission Impossible franchise, and I think it's very safe to say that it's one of the most consistent franchises ever. If you look at a franchise that has had almost every movie be good, if not great, I think Mission Impossible absolutely wins that argument. And I genuinely think that at least almost every movie up until the last one, besides Mission Impossible 2, have been great. Or really good at least. And, Mission Impossible 2 is I'm not gonna lie, it's a very bad movie, but it's really the only one in this franchise that I wouldn't watch again. I would just rewatch any of the other movies any time of the week. They're all very good. I actually think it's a franchise that has gotten only better over time. I think numbers 4 through 7 are all very good to great, starting off with Ghost Protocol and then Dead Reckoning. So I was super excited to see what Tom Cruise and writer-director Christopher McQuarrie would come up with, especially since the last movie, Dead Reckoning, worked sort of as a part 1 and leads directly into what The Final Reckoning does. And when this movie was sort of announced, it was Dead Reckoning Part 2. It wasn't called The Final Reckoning, so now, once we knew it was going to be, final, that kind of added another thing of is this the last Mission Impossible movie? Is this going to be the end of the franchise? And that kind of, spiraled a bit of questions, made me kind of wonder, what's this going to be like? And as for The Final Reckoning, I think it's a pretty good, not great film. When the movie delivers, it's exactly what I wanted out of it. It delivers everything you could possibly want and everything I loved about the last few movies. But when it becomes more concerned with the story and kind of the hows and whats of what's going on here, I found myself fairly confused by some of the choices made. I'm not really sure what kind of the intentions were behind some of those choices. It just felt the creatives were backed into a corner by the studio and were just we need to make this movie very accessible and we need to make it very clear to people who maybe don't remember the last movie. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit more, but I just think in that regard this movie just didn't live up to what I wanted, but in other areas it more than lived up to that hype. The fact that this movie is a direct follow-up to another movie should have meant that all of the legwork was already done by the last one, so this movie could just simply focus on paying things off, but no. For the first half of this movie, it really spends almost the entirety of that time recapping not just the last movie, but other movies in the franchise. And personally, I found that to be very frustrating as someone who is pretty familiar with the other movies and what happened in them. I understand not everyone does watch the movies like I do. Maybe not everyone's refreshed like I am. So I think having a little bit of a recap can help. But when the first hour basically of your 3-hour movie is just recapping things that we already knew, that's a little bit frustrating. I just don't think it does it as efficiently as other movies have. And you take a look at a movie like Avengers Endgame, which I think it spends the first hour of that movie just kind of catching us up with where the characters are, but not exactly recapping what's happened before. It does it very efficiently, so you're still interested in where it's going, but it's also kind of refreshing you on what happened. And I just think that's a very good way to do these things. But in the case of Mission Impossible, the movie uses a lot of flashbacks, and I think it's bothered me a little less as I saw it again and thought about it more, but I'm still very convinced that there were far more efficient ways of conveying that information to audiences who haven't seen or forgot what happened in Dead Reckoning. I'm pretty sure, similar to Endgame, you could have just had characters mention things in passing, just kind of when that happened, or blah, 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 remember when that happened? There were much better ways you could have done it. Imagine if you were watching Avengers Endgame, right after you watched Infinity War, and then you're seeing flashbacks of things that happened in Infinity War, and you're just I just saw this movie. I don't need to know what happens again. Just move on with the story. That's really how I felt during Final Reckoning. And because a lot of that first hour to hour and a half is filled with a lot of filler, the pacing is hurt a lot in my opinion. Especially on rewatch, you can absolutely feel the nearly 3-hour runtime. And I'm very confident this movie could have been at least 20 minutes shorter had they just trimmed a lot of the fat off and the filler off in that first hour. Like, Dead Reckoning is like 2.5 hours, maybe even a little longer than that. But I would say that movie is paced very well. Like, everything happens very efficiently, things just move into the next thing. It just keeps moving very constantly and consistently, and I love that movie. I think it's very, even though the long runtime is like a bit, it's a bit like overwhelming, it definitely moves at a quick pace, so it goes by quickly. Final Reckoning just goes by very slow, and that just kind of hurt my enjoyment of this movie a bit. It also doesn't help that this movie is jam-packed with characters. You have like 10 side characters to keep track of, and it's not like a lot of them have much development, so you just have to kind of remember their faces. Like, you don't even know their names really. You just kind of have to remember, like, oh, that guy does that thing for this person, it's way too many characters, but not a lot of them that we remember from other things, so you just kind of have to go along with it and just kind of like figure out who they are. And then my last big complaint for the movie is that the first hour also just feels like it was tampered with a lot. And if you don't know what I mean, I'm just saying, like, it feels like the studio or someone really said, like, all right, we need to make this movie feel very different in the first hour. Like, it felt like the first hour was just, like, completely, like, restructured, re-edited, just kind of, like, played around with a lot until it was a completely different thing than what they started out with. And what I mean by that also is, like, for example, in this movie, not really a spoiler of any kind, just kind of mentioning something that happens in the first act, very vaguely. So, like, the character Luther, we've seen in a lot of the other movies, he's seen doing something in the first act, and it feels like we as an audience missed a whole subplot with his character. Like, we knew where he ended up in the end of the last one. He starts off in the beginning of this movie kind of doing something related to that a little bit. But then it's like, you have this other big thing that's just like, what did I miss here? Like, I feel like I missed an entire, like, thing with his character that, I was supposed to know. Like, why is he in this situation right now? And it's things like that that just kind of give the movie this feeling of messiness, this feeling of, like, nobody really, like, had a clear structure of this movie. Like, it just kind of gives this feeling of, people just putting the movie together, just kind of like cutting things out, and just being like, I think it makes enough sense as it is, but then you're missing this whole thing, and I understand why they probably cut stuff. I mean, this movie was already long enough as it is. To add more stuff would just make the pacing even worse. But I think at the same time, you should have maybe reshot it and just kind of like clarified some stuff. I think there's probably something they could have done to make it a little more clear, because it has this feeling of just like, what's missing here? Like, it just feels like pieces of a puzzle are just not here that we're supposed to have. And I think it does take away a little bit from the movie. I think that first hour just really doesn't work quite as well as it should. And you'll notice I said the movie was pretty good in the beginning, and then I just listed all of my big problems with the film. And that's mainly because most of my problems do stem from the same thing, this one thing, in the first hour of the movie. And I do have a few other, like, little complaints, like the score being kind of forgettable compared to the other ones, and the villain being pretty generic still. I really wish we had more development for this Gabriel character. Even the entity is kind of underwhelming in this movie, but it's not really worth getting too far into, because those are more like minor nitpicks. The movie overall, though, is still pretty good in my eyes, and there's a good reason for that, even despite all the problems I just mentioned, which probably you're listening to us and you're like, how did you even like this movie? It sounds like you didn't like it. But there is a lot I did like, and mainly I'll just get into, once this movie does start going, and you'll know exactly when it does, it's a lot of fun. Surprisingly, this is one of the least action-heavy Mission Impossible movies that I've seen, and it's because the movie spends a lot of time looking at the current state of things in the world, in this world, and how it really does seem like it could end. And in that way, this does feel like a finale where things don't seem as easy as they normally are. Not that they're ever easy for these characters. I mean, you could argue like things are near impossible, wink wink, but, you always feel like there's a way out. Like, even in Mission Impossible Fallout, like, a bomb's about to go off. You feel like, it could go off, but you're like, it's probably not going to. This time it feels a little different, though. Like, it does have that feeling of, like, oh, like, I don't know. Like, there's a real sense of dread here. Like, there's a sense of, like, something is going to happen. A lot of people could die in this movie, and we're not sure how or where or when, but, it has that feeling of dread. and it's a more somber Mission Impossible movie. It really does try to feel a little different than everything else that's come before it. It's not exactly a fun movie for the first half of it. And, once the action does kick in, it gets like very exciting. It's a blockbuster, but before that, it's much more of a drama. And even though there are a lot of characters in this movie, all the actors do an excellent job, particularly Tom Cruise, Simon Pegg, Haley Atwell, and Rolf Saxon. And even though there's not a lot of action in this movie, when it's there, it's great. There are two big stunts in this film, and they're all-timers for this franchise. I think one being the most intense in the franchise, and the other being the most insane. The plane sequence in particular is mind-blowingly good. It's the kind of scene you just want to jump out of your seat during and yell at Tom Cruise for being the madman he is. It's really fun. I mean, the way... I don't know how he did half the stuff he did in this movie. Like, I saw a behind-the-scenes clip the other day of, like, something that happened in that scene, and I was, like, pretty sure watching the movie, even that for, like, Tom Cruise was too much. Like, that had to be, like, CGI or green screen or something, because, I mean, he does his own stunts, but I'm like, there's a certain point where you're like, that cannot be possible. And of course he did it in real life. Like, I'm like, how? How did you do that? It's really crazy. But he's awesome. Tom Cruise really puts his, like, heart and soul into these. He puts his life into this franchise. And I respect the man for it. He does an excellent job here. And then I also really enjoyed seeing the subplots in this story. There is one especially interesting one revolving the president, and it takes a more grounded approach to the story. It's not, like, as big as what Tom Cruise is doing. It's a much more small scale, like, all right, we have to discuss, like, what's the best thing we can do here. And I think it added a different kind of stakes to the story and made the third act even more intense. It just kind of, like, builds things up to be like, oh, wow, like, if this doesn't work out, like, things can get really crazy here. And it just adds this other layer to the movie, which just, like, made it even more intense, as I said. And I think that really leads me into my biggest compliment of the film, which is that the entire third act is excellent. The entire third act is, like, terrific. It's some of the best things I've ever seen in Mission Impossible. I was so on the edge of my seat. I, like, had my mouth covered. Like, I was covering my mouth at points. Like, oh my god, like, this is ridiculous. And it's actually a very similar finale to the Mission Impossible Fallout one, but it still hits just as hard, if not even harder. And everything that happens in it, I was just like, wow, this is fantastic. Like, if the whole movie was like this, it would be like a 5 out of 5. But, unfortunately it's not. But the third act is just terrific. I mean, it makes up completely for the first act, which wasn't great. I think it adds, like, a whole few, like, stars to my rating here. But as a finale here, I think this is a good one. It still leaves room open for another movie should they decide to make one, which I don't know if they will, honestly. I mean, these movies don't exactly make, like, a ton of money. And the budget for this movie is probably insane, but I think if they do decide to make one, there's definitely room for it. But for this saga of 8 movies here, it's also a nice place to end things, should they choose to just let it be the swan song. And if they do choose to let this be the last movie in the franchise, I think it at least ended on a high note. It at least did what it set out to do. And The Final Reckoning is certainly not a perfect film by any means, and it starts off quite messy. But as it chugs along, it gets better and better. And as I said, it ends on a very high note. It's one of the highest notes in the franchise, probably. And, as a film, it's not exactly a very high recommend. Like, if I'm looking at this as a film, I don't think it's really a great movie. But if you've been following this franchise along, I think it's absolutely worth checking out for sure on the biggest screen you can find. This movie rocked in IMAX, by the way. So it's kind of like, give or take, if you're not very invested in this franchise, I don't think it's a must-see for you. But if you do like the other Mission Impossible movies like me, it's kind of a must-see. So I'm going to give this movie a B. Certainly not perfect, but definitely entertaining. Alright, and next up is Lilo and Stitch. Oh boy, so I actually have a lot to say about this live-action remake. But first, let me say a couple things. One, I actually rewatched the original film just a few days before watching this new one, and found it to be even better than I remembered. I think it's actually a great movie, and one of Disney's most heartfelt stories ever. It's a really good movie, certainly very emotional, very heartwarming, and just a really great film. But second is that even though I'm typically not a fan of the Disney live-action remakes, and I think they're for the most part incredibly unnecessary, they really just kind of tamper the originals and, they're not hurting the originals, but they completely exists just for money and to keep the, IP alive and whatever, and make you go to the amusement park, I guess. But I actually had some faith in this one because of the director, Dean Fleischer Camp. He made the movie Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, which is probably one of my favorite movies of the decade so far and is absolutely one of the most emotional for me. So you mix together someone who has made a very heartfelt movie and a story that is already very heartfelt to begin with, and I think you could have a real winner on your hands. So I ask now, why is it that this remake of Lilo and Stitch missed the mark so badly? Why is it that they made certain changes that completely contradict the message of the original film? And why is it that despite having a lot of the core scenes from the original movie here, I felt nothing watching it? And that's something I've been thinking about a lot over the last few days since watching this movie. And the conclusion I've reached is that the people involved, namely the writers and director, just don't have a clear understanding of what people loved about the original. And I think a lot of what they took away watching the original is Stitch is a fun character, Lilo is a very silly and a rebel, and that family comes from unexpected places. But what they did not understand, however, are the themes of Ohana, that nobody gets left behind, the idea that people push others away when they want to be closer to them, how loneliness leads to longing for attachment, and how people who may seem bad are actually trying to do some good in the world. And very little of that is explored in this new movie, and it's actually even missing one of the most crucial scenes from the original, which I'm not going to say which one here, but if you love the original, you probably know what scene I'm talking about, and I'm very mad that scene's missing, actually, because I think the fact that that's missing is just, like, a total, like, giveaway that they just didn't understand what the original was about. Right off the bat, I'm just going to say the two things I liked about this movie, because otherwise I just really don't have anything nice to say. One is, I hope I'm saying her name correctly, forgive me if I'm not, Maya Kiloha as Lilo, and the other is Chris Sanders as Stitch. I'm not saying I even liked what the movie did with their characters, I'm just saying I liked the actors as these characters. And fun fact, Chris Sanders is actually returning from playing Stitch in the original film. And additionally, he is actually one of the co-directors of the original too. So Chris Sanders actually has a very big attachment to that original movie here. But I think Kailoha as Lilo actually did a good job too. I think that was good casting, and she definitely captures the spirit of the character. So the actors really aren't at fault here for anything. They tried their best. The movie let them down in other areas. But most of the other casting choices I wasn't a fan of. Zach Galifianakis as Jumba is one of the worst. I mean, it's not even like, Zach Galifianakis really was bad in the movie. It's just that I don't think he was a good choice for the role. They couldn't even just have him do a similar accent to Jumba, so it sounds almost nothing like the character we know and love. So that was very frustrating. I also hated what they did with his character. He's annoying, unlikable, and I didn't like the way that things wrapped up with him at all. It was very unsatisfying. The same could be said for Nani, Lilo's sister, and I think they did her even dirtier than Jumba, to be honest. I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to say, but I think she was just very unlikable, very hard to sympathize with. And similar to Jumba, by the end of the movie, I was not happy at all about what they did with her. They just really messed up those two characters in ways that really frustrated me. I think they're like some of the weakest points in the movie. As for the rest of the movie, it's mostly just a worse version of the original in every way. It's kind of boring, not very funny, and simultaneously rushes through and overstays its welcome. It's just not an emotional movie in any way. It doesn't really have the heart of the original. It just feels very, I don't want to say soulless, but it has that Disney live-action remake feeling where you're just like, you didn't capture any of the feelings in the original, and it just feels like this only exists to sell toys. So I guess maybe it is soulless. I don't know, you tell me. Maybe some people did like this movie. I don't know. There are a lot of people who did seem to enjoy it. I mean, audiences love this movie. If you look at Rotten Tomatoes, the audience score is even higher than the original, which, don't ask me why. I just really think, especially as someone who just watched the original again, this movie is so much worse. And I'm really not sure if I prefer this to a movie like Snow White or not, the recent Snow White, because on one hand, that Snow White film is probably worse. Like, as a movie, it's probably worse. But on the other hand, I actually kind of admired most of that movie's changes, even though they were executed horribly. Whereas Lilo and Stitch just completely butchers a lot of what's so good about the original. And to make things even more frustrating here, I'm going to say this. I actually think some of the changes in this movie could have worked. I could see a version of this movie where I liked it far more than I did, had they just done those changes a little differently. Like, had they kept the changes but actually earned them, had they actually, like, taken the time to write out these things so, like, characters really established how they felt and maybe they had a little bit of a different relationship. But the movie's just kind of like this weird thing where it's like it has all these weird choices, but then for the most part plays out very similarly to the original. So then it's just like you should have just went all in on the changes like Snow White did. Like Snow White, a few core scenes from the original here and there, but for the most part very different. And I think Lilo and Stitch either needed to do completely different, lean into the changes more, or it needed to just be a very safe remake. But the problem here is that the script is just so poorly done, and it doesn't actually earn any of the changes it made. The characters just didn't grow enough over the course of the movie to warrant those changes, so I'm really upset by what they did there. Look, I really don't like this movie. I mean, when I first walked out, I was going to give it a C-. The more I'm thinking about it, and, I read one of my friend's reviews who really butchered the film. He hates this movie. He kind of convinced me to go a little lower there, so I'm going to give this movie a D+. Look, the movie unfortunately just isn't worth your time and money. The original is on Disney Plus right now, and it's so much better, not to mention a lot shorter too. But even with that shorter runtime, it feels far more complete and is a much more satisfying emotional experience. And that about does it for this episode. If you want to follow my reviews, you can find me on Letterboxd at MovieKing1224. You can also listen to this podcast on your favorite apps such as Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. If you have any comments or feedback, I would love to hear it and improve the show. And of course, if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell to hear more like it. I appreciate you all so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.